Prime Minister denounces the attack on a Melbourne synagogue as counter-terrorism units investigate.
The atrocities that occurred at the synagogue in Melbourne clearly were designed to create fear in the community.
A ruling party boycott sees South Korea's parliament fall short of impeaching President Yoon Suk-yeol, but the party concedes he has to go.
And Australia strikes back after a poor Perth performance, winning the second test against India in Adelaide.
Hello and welcome to our special coverage of the dramatic developments in Syria. I'm Ruby Cornish.
And I'm Joe O'Brien. The Syrian government appears to have fallen in a stunning end to the 54-year rule of the Assad family after a surprise insurgency launched just last week by rebel fighters. Syrian rebels said the capital city of Damascus was now free of Assad, with the head of an opposition war monitor saying President Bashar al-Assad had left the country to an undisclosed location. Insurgents said earlier they had entered Damascus without any sign of deployment of government forces.
Earlier, rebels took control of the central city of Homs and swarms of government forces have reportedly fled the city towards the Iraq border. Statues of the Assad family have been toppled across Syria as the Bashar al-Assad regime nears complete collapse after the rebels' surprise insurgency into Aleppo last week.
Middle East correspondent Eric Torchek joins us now from the Turkey-Syria border, and we've got Global Affairs editor John Lyons with us in the studio. Welcome to you both. Eric, to you first. What's the latest on the territory that the rebels have taken?
They've been pushing from multiple directions, Joe, coming in from the north, from Aleppo through Hama, through Homs, and then you've seen them enter the outskirts of the capital. And while that was happening, groups within the capital, opposition groups within the capital, obviously taking control of areas, particularly in the south, like Douma and Ghouta. And then in Deir ez-Zor in the east, Kurdish forces took control there, expelled the government, and we saw government troops, as you mentioned, crossing the border. And of course in the south, in Daraa and Suwaida, Druze area, and along the border with Jordan, there's been rebel groups, opposition forces seize control there. And it's been cause for enormous celebration to look at this regime collapsing from the outside in, and also, to see those scenes in Damascus. Just behind me before, you would have seen some Syrians celebrating. The border is already filling up with people who are looking to cross and return home and see their homes and families, people they haven't seen for years.
Is the Syrian army saying anything?
Just last night, we had a statement from the Syrian army saying everything is under control, our forces continue to fight, there are malicious and evil rumours being spread by the rebels and their supporters, they're not true, our forces are fighting valiantly. And now, as you see, that was completely false. Looked like the Syrian government forces had abandoned their positions, were throwing off their uniforms and withdrawing as quickly as they could. So it looks like there's been a complete collapse in the command and control in the Syrian army, or perhaps some agreements being done with the rebels to allow those rebel forces to move in. Spoke with a person this morning who's with the rebel forces on the outskirts of Aleppo. He said they're a bit stuck, on the outskirts of Damascus. He said they're a bit stuck there this morning, but they are moving in towards the centre of the capital now.
This has been so swift over the last several days. Is there any idea of how many people have died in this process? I haven't heard much at all about in terms of death tolls over the past week.
It's hard to know. There was fierce fighting around the city of Homs. The rebels were stuck there for some time around the northern outskirts of Homs. That appears to have been the toughest battle. There was also some fighting in Hama, which is north of Homs, but the rebels took that relatively easily in the space of 2 to 3 days. In Aleppo, there was apparently almost no fighting at all. The regime forces, the Iranian-backed militias, they simply collapsed and melted away. So, it's hard to know exactly. And also in Daraa, it looks like the regime forces collapsed there as well. There was some fighting around the border with Jordan, but the death toll, very hard to calculate. And Syria is such a complex situation. There are so many groups, there are so many interests. There's no centralised control. So, yeah, it's very, very difficult to answer that question.
And Eric, as you said, you're on the Turkey-Syria border right now. You're usually based in Turkey. So looking at this now from a Turkish perspective, what's been its involvement in this conflict over several years?
Oh, Turkey has had a key role, Joe, absolutely key role. Not only does it host millions of Syrian refugees, but the Turkish government backs opposition groups within Syria. And it's not really clear whether Turkey gave tacit approval for this rebel advance or the main rebel group leading it, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, simply, we've got some Syrians marching past me now, celebrating. Or the main group, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, simply moved, and then Turkey was forced to adapt to it. But there's no doubt Turkey has played a pivotal role in supporting the opposition, training, funding, arming many of the opposition groups based within Turkey. Its relationship with HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the listed terrorist group, is unclear, but it's certain that Turkey, if not it gave the approval, is certainly now supporting the HTS offensive. The President of Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, this has seen his influence in Syria. He's now one of the key players. Russia has been weakened, Iran enormously so, and also this solves a major domestic problem for President Erdogan. The ongoing presence of Syrian refugees in Turkey is a massive domestic political issue. Now that many will want to return home, that takes the pressure off.
And so that's possibly been one motivation for his support for the opposition against Bashar al-Assad. Can you give us any idea as to other motivations for Recep Tayyip Erdogan in this downfall of Assad?
Well, also just in terms of the political allegiances, you know, it's terms of having a Shia minority ruling the country to Turkey's south, and relations between Assad and Turkey had been bad for some time. Actually, the Turkish government, and particularly President Erdogan, had tried in recent months to restart relations with the Assad regime. They had told President Assad they were willing to kind of start dealing with him again as long as he could make some accommodation for refugees, that being one of the most pressing political concerns of the Turkish government. And now, and they said that Assad rejected all Turkey's offers and was very unreceptive to what Turkey was proposing. And now we see, just months after that process fell down, this is really the outcome from Turkey's perspective, is that fine, we will go back to our hardened support for these opposition groups, and perhaps Turkey's role has been influential, or if not pivotal, in seeing Assad removed from power.
Okay, Eric, make sure you stay safe there with all that traffic whizzing around you pretty close. But hopefully we'll come back to you pretty soon. We might go to Global Affairs Editor John Lyons. John, just put this in perspective for us, starting off with how the Assad family came to power in Syria decades ago.
Well, yes, Joe. The father, Hafez al-Assad, 54 years ago came to power. He's ruled with an iron fist ever since. In fact, there was one massacre of as many as 30,000 of his own people, where if he saw any sort of rebellion or any opposition to the government, they were ruthless. And when his son took over, Hafez, there was a sense that, he's a modern era, he might be different. His wife had been educated in the United Kingdom, in London. And so there was a sense inside Syria when I went there that there was things more positive. He was spending money on more universities. Then in 2011 came the peaceful protests as part of the whole Arab Spring and the uprisings or protests, especially in the South Daraa. And he cracked down on that with extraordinary brutality, far more than was proportionate. And as a result of that, more demonstrations around the country, it descended into civil war, all sorts of groups. The Americans were involved in there, the Turks, as Eric Torchek was saying, the Kurds up in the north, the Israelis had a big interest, the proxies in there, the Iranians, Hezbollah came in large numbers of fighters. It became this incredible potpourri of proxy interests and fighting, and Hezbollah really, as a Shia group, they managed to destroy and kill a lot of the Sunni fighters, and they kept Bashar al-Assad in power. Now that Hezbollah's weak, Russia's distracted, clearly these rebels, the Sunni rebels, have come through the middle. It's all at the moment, though, too neat to me. It's like there's been no resistance. I can't see that it's going to be happily ever after in Syria.
Yeah, so tell us about this group UTS that is leading the rebel groups.
Well, that's right. It's in fact, Australia designated them as a terrorist group, described them as a hardline Sunni Islamist group who wanted to topple Bashar al-Assad. That was only a recent assessment by the Australian government when they declared them as a terrorist group. Likewise in America. And they are an offshoot of al-Qaeda. They went up to Idlib, and it looked like the Syrian government thought they're not a problem. Rather than try to completely crush them, we'll let them stay up there. Meanwhile, obviously, they were running what they saw as a little caliphate. And in fact, the Australian government's assessment is that they do want a caliphate to be established, an Islamic caliphate established in Syria. And so, in the end, now it looks like, and they're now in control of the massive chemical weapons supplies. So I think the future is extremely unclear.
Was it the case that they were originally framing themselves as a religiously motivated group, and since then they've talked that around to being taking a position which would seem more popular with the general population in Syria?
They have tried to say that they're no longer hardline. They've tried to distance themselves from al-Qaeda, saying that we're not as bad as them. But my concern about that is we saw in Afghanistan the Taliban saying, Taliban 2.0 when they came back, we are now the softer, the more modern Taliban, and yet they've been as brutal and medieval in their treatment of women in particular and girls as anybody. So could be. So when this group talks about, we are now a much more modern, we're open to a broad church of people, I'm not sure that's a convincing view.
Yeah. OK, we might go back to Eric Torchek now, if we've still got him there on the Turkey-Syria border. Eric, I'm just interested to know how much contact you've had with Syrians within Turkey over your time there, and just talk to us about how big that population is and what they want to do now that now that it appears Bashar al-Assad is gone.
So one Syrian friend said to me the other day, Joe, this is like a dream. She couldn't believe that it was happening. So there's around 4 million Syrians that are, around the borders of Syria in Turkey and Istanbul and the major cities. And look, they have, they've been enduring quite tough conditions. They have rights within Turkey, but they haven't always been treated fantastically. Many, are working here, have their families here, go to school here, but they're desperate to return home. It was never, a choice to leave. So what they're saying is that they view this moment, all of them that I've spoken to view this moment very, very positively. They're enormously hopeful, and many come from Aleppo in the north, which used to be Syria's largest city, the commercial and really the cultural capital as well. And that was one of the worst affected by the civil war. So Aleppo, one of the first cities to be freed under this rebel offensive, and they were so happy at the prospect of going home. And we've been talking to people who in the last few days have returned to Aleppo. They say the situation is calm. They're seeing family members they haven't seen since 2016. So in Turkey, I think a lot of Syrian refugees, some of them now, they're waiting to see what happens with the situation. They're waiting to see, politically, who's going to be in control, how they will govern Syria, the transitional arrangements. They'll want to see things stabilise before they go back. But most of them that I've spoken to are intending to go back. They're enormously hopeful that this is the start of a new era for Syria.
And what is usually the case with the Syrian border you're on there? Is it they're usually free-flowing traffic, or what is the usual situation? How's that changed today?
Well, no, there's already a group of Syrians who are at the border waiting to cross. I was here yesterday, and there was another group of people ready to go home, and to go home to places that had recently fallen to the rebels, like Deir ez-Zor in the east, and they hadn't been able to go there for many years. But the situation here, normally the crossing, you can cross as a Syrian, obviously, and then Turkey also has a presence in Idlib province, which is the province on the border here, the northwestern province that was controlled, as John mentioned, by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and has been for some years. So there's been movement in between those provinces. Now, it's for foreigners, it's much harder. I'm still waiting for permission to go into Idlib, and I need that from the Turkish government. That's the government that's been controlling the access. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham will give us permission to go in and report, but at the moment Turkey is being very cautious about foreign press, and it's not letting us cross the border to see what's happening inside Syria.
And has Syria been such a mess partly because of its geographic position in the centre of so much influence there in the Middle East?
There's a couple of reasons. The first is historic, and it's, in the battles for the various states, around the fall of the British Empire and Egypt. And, Syria and Egypt at one point were briefly connected in something called the United Arab Republic. Then that fell, and then Assad, Bashar al-Assad's father, took over in a coup in 1970. And in order to secure his rule, he created this insane repressive security state, that led to Syria being called the Kingdom of Silence. So the history is that, Syria, which has really been among the kind of the cultural heart of the Arab world, became this state of repression and fear. And anyone who questioned that situation disappeared into one of its many prisons. The largest prison population per capita in the world was in Syria. And so that history has led to incredible instability, and the need by this minority rule, to maintain a state of fear has created a very abnormal political situation. And the second reason is the geopolitics, as you mentioned, and with great powers like, the US on the one hand and Israel, Russia competing for influence in the Middle East, Turkey, Iran, all these great powers, they come together in Syria, and it's a theatre for great power competition. And the Syrian government being backed by Iran and Russia, and being on the border with Israel, and the Golan Heights are under Israeli occupation. This has all created enormous stability and ongoing conflict. And Israel's role in what's happened over the last week really shouldn't be understated. Israel has been targeting and killing with ruthless efficiency Iranian commanders in Syria who were coordinating the Iranian militias and Iranian military presence that was withstanding the rebel advances, particularly in Aleppo. And it's destroyed facilities linked to Iran, and it's been targeting them very effectively and very consistently. So Israel has weakened the Iranian presence here to the extent that when rebel groups attacked Aleppo, the city collapsed without a whimper. So the role of Israel, not just Turkey, as I mentioned, has been pivotal as well.
But presumably these rebel groups will be no friend of Israel's either.
Actually, there's been statements from HTS that they don't want to fight with Israel. And Israel has had a role in supporting some rebel groups in Syria before, when it was considering whether or not it would be advantageous to see Bashar al-Assad's regime fall. Israel's position has changed on the Syrian civil war a couple of times. Initially, it thought it might be good if Bashar al-Assad fell. Then it thought it might be good to keep him in power, and they maybe could negotiate to take permanent control of the Golan Heights. Then in recent years, it's been thought that Assad was the least worst option. But now that we've even seen HTS, reach out and make statements to Israel that we're not a threat, it's not really our concern to fight you. And I think that's proof of a couple of things. One, HTS being prudent and cautious, and the other is that, really the biggest battle is to take control of Syria and work out how it will be governed first, and everything else is secondary.
And we might go to Global Affairs Editor John Lyons now. John, how does this reflect on the position of Russia and Iran?
Well, Joe, it's a big blow for Russia and Iran, that they've been so distracted with other things. For Russia, that naval base there allowed it to bring by ship weapons into Syria if it wanted to, and it allowed Iran to bring weapons across Syria into Lebanon for the fight against Israel. Just a bit of breaking news. Syrian rebels have put out in a televised statement, said they have freed Damascus and ousted the regime. The Syrian rebels have also announced the release of all prisoners from the prisons. The Syrian army has actually put out an intriguing statement saying our military is continuing operations against terrorist groups in Hama and Homs and Deraa, which is odd because it looks like the regime has collapsed, but perhaps there's a few pockets there of resistance.
Yeah. OK, we'll leave it there for the moment. John Lyons, our Global Affairs Editor, and Eric Torchek on the Turkey-Syria border.
We're going to bring in Dr. Roger Shanahan now, who is a Middle East analyst. He joins us from Sydney. Dr. Shanahan, thanks for your time. This was a truly rapid insurgency. It took much of the international community by surprise. Just 8 days ago, as John Lyons put it earlier, Syria was a rock in the Middle East, and then cities began to fall one after another. Can you just give us a sense of how things played out?
Well, listen, militarily, it's very difficult to regain momentum once it's been lost, and certainly the opposition groups chose their time well. There'd been preparation over many, many months for this to occur, and that was evident in the way that they deployed, but also made sure that after they had taken over a location, there was an administrative tail that could at least calm the population and let them know that there was, in place of chaos, some administrative capacity. So they were able to build up a significant degree of momentum and focused on the large provincial capitals rather than much slower advance through the rural areas. And as they became aware that the Syrian military was not putting up a fight much at all, then they took advantage of that and probably accelerated their operational aims and stayed well in advance of the Syrian regime's ability to cope with it. Not only the Syrian regimes, but also regional states who are really responding to fast-folding events on the ground.
Why do you think it is that we saw that lack of resistance? Was it an inability to resist, or were people, happy to see the rebels come in?
Probably a combination of there's rarely one factor that leads to this. A gradual hollowing out of the capabilities of the Syrian military. When it comes down to it, conflicts on the ground are really a battle of wills, and if one side truly believes in the cause that they're fighting for and the other side believes far less in the cause that they're fighting for, then one side wins that battle of wills and they can build up this military momentum. Syrian military, largely a conscript army, not entirely, and that's probably one of the more concerning, puzzling things about how the formations like the 4th Division were not deployed earlier in key parts of the terrain to Damascus's north to try and buy them time. Because what we saw at the outbreak of the uprising in 2012 was a similar collapse of large parts of the Syrian military. But there was time for, first of all, Iranian-backed elements and then later Russia to come to the assistance of the Assad regime. Things happened so quickly this time, and the resistance put up by the Syrian military was so ineffective that neither of those countries really came to the assistance of the Assad regime because they didn't believe that it was going to survive.
Yeah, can you speak a bit more to the political significance of Syria, especially its importance to many of the world's superpowers who have vested interests in the country?
Well, listen, it's an extremely complex country, and that's going to be one of the issues in the future about after the euphoria has died down of the fall of the Assad regime. How do you actually govern a country that is, in effect, an artificially constructed country? Regionally, it has provided over the last few years the conduit between Iran and its allies, particularly Hezbollah, in terms of a land main supply route between those two countries through Iraq and then through Syria and into Lebanon. It's also been the key Middle Eastern ally for Russia for longer than even the Assad regime has been there. And there have been tens of thousands of Russian advisors who have passed through Syria over more than half a century, and the port at Tartus and the airbase near to it has provided a logistic footprint for Russia in the eastern Mediterranean and has allowed it not only to have influence in Syria but more broadly. So if they were to lose that, that would be a strategic blow for Russia's global influence. And then there's the issue with Syria, which still occupies Syrian territory in the Golan Heights. And Syria under Assad had characterised itself as a leader of the Arab resistance to Israel, never had a peace treaty and was wholly objectioned to that. So it's a key part of the puzzle, given its geographic location, given its historical relevance, but also given the nature of the Syrian country itself in the north, with its Kurdish minority, which brings in Turkey, who wants to control its equities on the southern border. It is a significant player in the region, and the fall of the Assad regime is going to have reverberations for years to come.
We've heard the United Nations Special Envoy for Syria calling for an orderly political transition. I mean, after 54 years of an Assad regime, what will the challenges be in that transition?
Yes, we've already seen, as we said, the opposition groups were quite well organised in terms of their planning in the event of success. They've obviously had to accelerate those plans, but we've already seen the Syrian Prime Minister get on state television and say there would be an orderly transfer of responsibilities. And also we've seen from al-Sham put out a public statement that telling its armed elements not to approach public buildings. And so what we're seeing in the short term, at least, is al-Sham wanting to maintain the technical abilities of, as far as possible, of the Syrian state to provide services to the population. Obviously, they don't want to inherit a system any more broken than it currently is, and it makes for a much more orderly transition when they formally take over power, to have a state that is still functioning, unlike what we've seen in some of the other transitions in the region. The issues obviously are going to be much more in the months and the years to come for an ideologically based opposition group. Can you then rule for all and rule fairly for all? What kind of laws are you going to govern under? What's the constitution going to look like? Those are for tomorrow and the days after. But in the short term, it looks as though there's been a reasonably ordered transition and a desire to have technocrats still in charge of state services in the short term, at least.
Reuters has been reporting that the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad boarded a plane and left Damascus, that he went to an unknown location. Where might he have gone, and what could be the future for him?
Yeah, listen, it's very difficult to tell where he's gone, and probably it's not going to be made public until they're sure that he and whoever else is related to him or needs to leave the country has left the country. There's probably a limited list of people who he may have gone to, and he may have gone to a country in the short term because these events happened so rapidly that he was most likely taken by surprise, as much as the regional states. So we don't know where he is at the moment. It may be an interim stop until a longer-term solution for his ongoing presence is sorted out. but he will be persona non grata for the remainder of his life.
All right, we'll leave it there. Dr. Roger Shanahan, Middle East analyst, thank you so much for your insights.
My pleasure.
And welcome once again to our continuing special coverage of these dramatic developments in Syria over the past 24 hours. It's actually been happening over the past week. Everyone's been commenting, all the experts have been saying how swift this rebel advance has been, starting through the northwest of Syria and just in the last 24 hours taking it over Damascus. And it appears Bashar al-Assad is now out of the country, as Ruby was just discussing with Roger Shanahan. And just repeating that news that John Lyons brought us a minute ago. So Syrian rebels have declared Damascus liberated on state TV. The opposition has broadcast their first statement to Syrians on state TV moments ago. This is a translation from Al Jazeera. The city of Damascus has been liberated, said one man who was dressed in civilian clothes. They went on to say the tyrant Bashar al-Assad has been toppled. All the prisoners have been released from the prison of Damascus. We wish all our fighters and citizens preserve and maintain the property of the state of Syria. Long live Syria. So that's the first comments we've seen from the rebels since this news came through that they've taken Damascus, and also reports that Bashar al-Assad has fled the country.
Well, let's take a breath now and turn to some other news. The Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, says the firebombing of a Melbourne synagogue is, in his view, clearly an act of terrorism. Police are still investigating the motive behind the attack in Melbourne's southeast, where counter-terrorism teams due to meet tomorrow morning. Political reporter Nicole Hegarty has more from Canberra.
There is a process involved in declaring an incident to be a terrorist incident, with both state and federal agencies involved in that process. The Prime Minister has faced calls from the opposition leader and others to explain why this hasn't already been deemed to be a terrorist incident. Today, it's just a few minutes ago really, he did say quite clearly that in his personal view, it does meet the criteria to be a terrorist incident. He said that it's quite clearly aimed at creating fear within the community. He also went on to defend his government's response to growing anti-Semitism in Australia and the steps that they have taken, including introducing new laws, outlawing hate symbols, for example. Take a listen.
We've had a landmark ban on the Nazi salute and hate symbols that came into effect in January of this year. We've appointed Gillian Siegel as Australia's first ever envoy on anti-Semitism. We have criminalised doxing in legislation that was passed just a week ago as part of our privacy laws. Legislation, I might say, that was opposed by the Liberal and National parties in the House of Representatives and in the Senate. We've had legislation to appoint Australia's first national student ombudsman, and we have consistently, whether it be on the Insiders program on October 8 at 9 a.m. We were there unequivocally condemning the attacks on October 7. The following day I called for the rally that was planned for the Sydney Opera House to not go ahead. We call out every action of anti-Semitism when we see it.
Nicole, what can you tell us about this investigation that's underway?
Well, Ruby, the investigation is very much still ongoing. Tomorrow there will be a meeting with both Victorian Police and members of the Australian Federal Police in Melbourne, where they will go through the details of where their investigations are up to in relation to this. It's understood there are 3 suspects, but this focus tomorrow for the meeting will be on whether it does meet the technical definition of a terrorism incident, we understand. So much to still happen in this investigation, but both levels at the state and federal are involved quite heavily in this, including counter-terrorism forces.
And hundreds of people have gathered at a vigil in Melbourne's southeast to show support for the Jewish community after the synagogue firebombing. Reporter Cyan Valance was there.
The interior of the Adass Israel Synagogue is gutted, but its congregation is stoic. They were joined by hundreds of other people at a nearby park this morning in a show of solidarity for the Australian Jewish community amid growing fears of anti-Semitism. Up to 1,000 people gathered in the suburb of Ripponlea in Melbourne's southeast, just across the road from where the synagogue was set alight on Friday morning. Speakers called for an end to the hate, the mood one of grief, hope and anger. The Melbourne Jewish community members were joined by local, state and federal politicians calling for action. While the enormous turnout has given attendees hope, there is support out there. They say many Australian Jews are still living in fear.
Standing with the Jewish community in the face of this violence are the Australian people, champions of freedom, champions of equality and champions of the dignity of each and every single human being to live their life the way they wish.
Dozens of police and private security surrounded the park as the Premier revealed counter-terrorism units from Victoria Police and the AFP are investigating.
I can understand well the Victorian community are wanting to hear about the progress of this investigation, because an attack on a synagogue, an attack on a place of worship is an attack on our way of life here in Victoria. We strongly condemn it and also support the work that Victoria Police on their investigation.
Investigators are searching for 3 suspects. Police have told the synagogue leadership the investigation is making progress.
A bishop from Melbourne has become Australia's highest-ranking Catholic after Pope Francis elevated him to position of cardinal during a grand ceremony at the Vatican. Europe Bureau Chief Zoe Ford reports.
Inside St Peter's Basilica here at the Vatican behind me, the Pope has created 21 new cardinals, and among them Mykola Bechok from Australia. The Ukrainian-born missionary has been living in Melbourne for the past 4 years. At 44, he becomes the youngest member of the College of Cardinals and Australia's highest-ranking Catholic. I spoke to him before the consistory ceremony and he said that he was very surprised to have been chosen, but very honoured too. You could see that he was warmly welcomed by the other members of the College of Cardinals, as well as Pope Francis himself. The two shared a moment during the service where the Pope also spoke to him in Ukrainian. Afterwards, Cardinal Bechok told me what the day has meant to him.
It's a little bit mixed, my feelings. On the one hand, I'm completely in peace, in hands of God. But on the other hand, I'm worrying about what is going on in Ukraine, because it's still a terrible war. Many people are dying. Russians still killing our people. We can say genocide of our people.
In the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, the cardinals are the next most senior members after the Pope, and the College of Cardinals is like an inner council for the Pope, advising him on how to run the Church worldwide. The selection of Cardinal Bechok has come as a surprise, but Vatican observers have told me that that's because Pope Francis likes to choose people from all corners of the globe and from the periphery, people who are deeply embedded in their communities. And he's also of a generation of church leaders who are not linked to the sex scandals of the past. Cardinal Bechok is only the 8th cardinal to have ever been chosen from Australia, and he is the first since the death of George Pell. He says he wants to be a cardinal for everyone, not just Australians and Ukrainians, and he hopes to be flexible, holy, accessible, and not one of eminence.
Zoe Ford reporting there. World leaders have attended the grand reopening of the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris more than 5 years after it was badly damaged by a fire. The Archbishop of Paris, Laurent Ulrich, rapped on the door, marking the start of the ceremony. The Gothic French icon is almost 900 years old and has been meticulously restored by thousands of craftsmen.
Inside, US President-elect Donald Trump met with French President Emmanuel Macron prior to the ceremony, along with Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky. French President Emmanuel Macron addressed the attendees and thanked donors for a combined $1.4 billion for the restorations.
We have rediscovered what great nations can do, achieve the impossible. This cathedral was thus the happy metaphor of what a nation is and what the world should be. Fraternity of people determined to make great choices, universal brotherhood and mutual aid.
OK, let's return to our breaking news now. The end of a 54-year Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad after a rapid rebel offensive. We are joined again by our Middle East correspondent Matthew Doran, who's in Jerusalem. Hi, Matt. Things have been moving quickly, but what has the response been across the region to these developments?
Ruby, I just want to bring you some news that's come through to us from the Israel Defence Forces. We knew that last night the IDF started to move more troops and more weapons and assets into the Golan Heights, the occupied territory along the Israel-Syrian border occupied by Israel. And we've just had in the last few seconds some extra information come through from the IDF. I just want to read it to you so I get it exactly right. The IDF saying that in accordance with the situational assessment following the recent events in Syria, including the entry of armed personnel into the buffer zone, the IDF has deployed forces in the buffer zone and in several other places necessary for its defence to ensure the safety of the communities of the Golan Heights and the citizens of Israel. We emphasise that the IDF is not interfering with the internal events in Syria, and the IDF will continue to operate as long as necessary in order to preserve the buffer zone and defend Israel and its citizens. Let's translate that because that is, of course, very technical speak here. That is saying that the IDF has actually deployed troops inside what we are saying is Syria's border there to try to patrol and enforce this buffer zone between the Golan Heights and Syria. So that shows that Israel is taking this very seriously, is taking this as a threat to its own territory, or at least that occupied area that it currently holds control over in the Golan Heights. And it suggested last night when it started to move troops into the Golan Heights, clearly there was intelligence that Israel was picking up from this part of the world that something seismic was about to happen. And as we've seen in the last couple of hours, that seismic event has been the apparent toppling of the Assad regime. 24 years of rule by President Bashar al-Assad, who is now reportedly having fled the country, and of course a period of time before that by his father, 5 decades of iron rule in Syria as a result. We have also heard this morning, local time, from the government of Jordan. This is the southern neighbour of Syria, and the Jordanian government saying that it is monitoring these situations very closely. It is committed to the security and the stability of the Middle East region. Obviously noting that this is a considerable shift in power here in the Middle East, and that while people may well be celebrating the fact that Bashar al-Assad has been toppled and that these rebel fighters have now appear to take control of Damascus, there are still a lot of unknown factors here, including exactly what will happen with that group, how it will try to enforce its control. We know that this organisation, formerly known as Jabhat al-Nusra, has been rebadged, renamed. It's tried to differentiate itself from al-Qaeda, the terrorist group there, which it previously had affiliations with. It is still designated a terrorist organisation by a number of countries, including Australia. So there are concerns as to how it will enforce its rule now that it appears to have taken control of this key city.
Matt, one of the most striking things about this takeover was its speed. I mean, just a week ago, the idea that Damascus would have been toppled was just unthinkable. Can you just talk us through the geography of the region and how those rebel forces travelled through Syria to where they are now in Damascus?
Yeah, Ruby, let's cast our mind back a week to just last weekend when there was a surprise attack by these rebel forces on the northern city of Aleppo, Syria's second largest city. That took everyone by surprise and came just a couple of days after a ceasefire was enforced between Israel and the Lebanese militant group Hezbollah in Lebanon. Hezbollah is a backer of the Assad regime and had been significantly depleted as a result of its conflict with Israel. So the fighters perhaps have said seen an opportunity to launch this attack as a result of that and have done so in Aleppo. They have then followed, they've followed the highway south, the M5 highway, which stretches from Aleppo down to Damascus. And along the way, they have taken control of the cities of Hama and, in the last couple of hours, Homs, before moving on to Damascus. Now, that shows how they have been able to quickly move towards Damascus, but there are some other strategic elements at play there, because it means that in taking control of those cities along the highway, they have also been able to cut off access to Syrian ports, including the port area of Latakia. Now, this is somewhere that there had been weapons being brought in. Certainly Russian supplies were being brought in through that area, Russian supplies backing up the Assad regime there. So again, not only taking control of these cities, but also cutting off some of those supply chains. And that's why we have then seen them these rebel fighters being able to advance very quickly on the Syrian capital there. It is quite startling the speed that this has happened, considering that this civil war has been running for 13 years and had effectively been frozen. That's the term that's been used by many analysts looking at this conflict, saying that not much had really happened. There was a stalemate, an impasse with the various groups that had been fighting against the Assad regime for many years. And now there has been this breakthrough, which people are still analysing to see exactly how that will affect the stability not only of Syria, but this broader region.
Matt, regarding Syria's neighbours, what are they doing with border crossings? Are they open currently, or have some of them closed?
It seems like most of those border crossings remain closed at the moment. Jordan closed its border crossing with Syria in the last couple of days as this situation started to gather ahead of steam, and we have seen reports from the Lebanon-Syria border of that border crossing also being closed, despite the fact that many Syrian refugees who have fled the country over the course of this conflict have rushed to the border, wanting to try to get back in now that the regime of Bashar al-Assad has been toppled. So it appears those border crossings are still closed, and I think that reflects the very volatile situation, the very fast-moving situation that we're seeing in Syria at the moment. None of these neighbouring countries are prepared to open up the floodgates to people potentially pouring out of Syria. We have seen reports of Syrian soldiers, government forces, having fled certain parts of the country, moving towards Iraq and that, but certainly to the south and to the west, and indeed to the north as well, because Turkey is another neighbouring country here. It appears those border crossings remain closed. So we'll monitor those developments as they continue to shift in the coming hours, Ruby.
And we'll be coming back to you, no doubt. Middle East correspondent Matthew Doran in Jerusalem, thank you.
And if you're just joining us, we're continuing our special coverage of developments in Syria, with news through in the last several hours that the rebels have taken Damascus and President Bashar al-Assad has fled the country. Professor Mehmet Ozalp is the head of the Centre for Islamic Studies and Civilization at Charles Sturt University. He joins us now from Sydney. Mehmet Ozalp, welcome. So have you been surprised just about how quickly this has happened?
Well, it wasn't that surprising, after the initial takeover of Aleppo and then Hama and Homs. It was just a matter of days for Damascus to fall as well. I'm not surprised by the fact that they have taken Damascus, but we were all surprised by the speed of the surprise attack of the first Aleppo.
Yeah, and so how has this happened? Why has the Assad regime failed to retain control and lost it so swiftly?
Well, Assad regime was dependent on international aid, and chiefly from Russia and Iran. And both of those countries have been in deep problems. Russia has been losing a lot of costly war in Ukraine. It pulled its supplies and forces out of Syria. Iran has been under a lot of pressure with respect to Hezbollah, their support, and they had a lot of internal issues. So actually, al-Assad pulled its whatever forces it had in Hama and Homs to Damascus, hoping that he would buy some time and some sort of help would arrive. And that he could launch a fight or resistance from Damascus. But unfortunately, the help did not arrive. Nobody wants to bet on a losing horse, and unfortunately al-Assad was that losing horse. And the psychology of his people in his government and armed forces have changed very quickly, and they have realized that it was not possible to win. So there's been mass defection and exit out of Syria.
And so what has characterised the reign of the al-Assad regime?
Unfortunately, al-Assad regime will be remembered by oppression and resistance to people of Syria taking a say in the course of their country. His father was far more ruthless, coming from that 70s, 80s, the Cold War era. And al-Assad was actually known to be a moderate member of the family, and there was some hopes that he would bring democracy or some sort of a democratic regime into Syria, and he had that opportunity. But unfortunately, he squandered the time that he had. And with Arab Springs in 2011, instead of choosing to once again choose the people of the country rather than his own regime, he has chosen to oppress whatever opposition that was happening in the country. So he will be known as the cause of the civil war in Syria and the deaths of hundreds and thousands of people and the displacement of millions of refugees around the neighbouring countries.
Yeah, there were horrific stories that emerged from the prison system in Syria. Did his regime and that of his father, has it done anything positive for Syria over the decades?
Well, not really. It's been a rule. Obviously, the country never stays the same, and they build roads and factories and whatever it needs. But there was no significant economic or political improvement in the country. And unfortunately, we cannot name any significant contribution to Syria or the region or the peace in the Middle East. It's been a source of a thorn in the whole international politics.
And so what was their motivation in terms of keeping this regime going for so long if they weren't really doing much at all for Syria? But was it about lining their own pockets and simply the maintenance of power?
The Assad, the family and the regime stood on the argument that Syria is made up of multi-ethnic and multi-faith or multi-sectarian populations or demographics, and that they need a modern secular state for it to stay stable. That was the argument, and that was the reason they have wanted to stay in power. But that didn't work, and obviously people wanted freedom. They wanted a say in the country. If Syria became a democratic country, there was a chance that Assad could have been elected, or go into opposition and still be a player in the country. He had some support from the Alawite sections of the society, and some of the secular Syrians were supporting him. But there was the forces of change. Was his undoing.
OK, I'd like to talk to you more, Mehmet Ozat, but unfortunately we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks so much for contributing to our coverage today.
Thanks for having me.
Let's recap on our breaking news now. The IDF says in light of recent events in Syria, they're deploying forces into what they call a buffer zone to ensure the safety of the communities in the Golan Heights and the citizens of Israel. The Syrian president has reportedly fled the country, and Islamist forces have begun a negotiation of a transition of power with the country's prime minister after taking the capital, Damascus. There are reports of celebrations on the streets as a rebel coalition led by Islamist group HTS enters the centre of President Bashar al-Assad's almost quarter-century rule over Syria. The insurgents swiftly took over large parts of the country in the last 10 days as Aleppo and then Hama and then the central city of Homs fell one after the other. The president, who inherited power after the death of his father Hafez al-Assad in 2000, has reportedly fled the capital. Army chiefs are understood to have told officers that Bashar al-Assad's rule has ended. It's a dramatic development in a 13-year-old civil war which began amid the Arab Spring in 2011.
And just in the last half hour or so, we've had news through of the rebels actually standing in front of standing in a TV studio and declaring that Damascus has been liberated. They said in that broadcast, city of Damascus liberated. The tyrant Bashar al-Assad has been toppled. All the prisoners have been released from the prisons of Damascus. So this continues to develop right now.
We're going to bring in our next guest now. Ayman Saikal is an Emeritus Professor of Middle Eastern, Central Asian and Islamic Studies at the Australian National University. He is in Canberra and with us now. Thank you so much for your time. First up, just your reaction to the news that this 54-year-old Assad regime is over. Has it taken you by surprise?
Well, it's extraordinary developments. I mean, I didn't expect it to happen so quickly, as I think the rest of the world felt the same way. But it is the culmination of popular uprisings which rose against Assad regime in 2011. In fact, by 2013, 2014, the regime was on the verge of collapsing, but it was the Iranians who basically saved it, and also Hezbollah from Lebanon provided support. And later, of course, from 2016, it was Russia that intervened, and its air force played a very critical role in enabling Assad to regain control over most of the major cities, including Aleppo. But of course, now that's all come undone.
Why is it, do you think, that the Assad regime was unable to retain control?
I think he had an opportunity. I mean, Assad had an opportunity in 2011 to negotiate a political settlement with the opposition. And I think at that time, the opposition was supported by the United States and Western allies, as well as the Arab League. And I think there could have been a more peaceful path to resolution of the problem. And of course, the uprising took place in the wake of the so-called Arab Spring, which had already swept a number of leaders or the dictators in the Arab world, in Egypt and Tunisia, as well as in Yemen, and it was that Arab Spring that also triggered the uprisings in Syria. But I think he missed a very big opportunity at the time. But I think partly because that he was also encouraged by Iran to stay in power, because Syria has had a close alliance with the Islamic Republic of Iran since the Iranian Revolution of 1978-79, which resulted in the overthrow of the Shah's pro-Western monarchy and replaced it by Ayatollah Khomeini's Islamic government. Because Syria had become a very critical element in the Iranian axis of resistance against Israel, as well as the United States. But now, with the fall of the Assad regime, that creates a very big hole in that axis of resistance. And it is a big loss for the Iranians, as well as for the Russians, because Russia has also established a very important strategic foothold in the Middle East, I mean, through its presence in Syria. But I think the new government or the new political power, which assumes the rule of Syria, will be very much apprehensive towards Russia, as well as the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about some of these countries with big vested interests. I mean, this will have huge ripple effects internationally, and Russia, as you say in particular, benefited from having Assad in power. How do you think they're feeling watching these events play out?
Well, I'm sure they are very much disappointed. I mean, of course, the Russians had already said that they will do whatever they can to protect the Assad regime. And, of course, they had activated their air force and had been bombing Aleppo and also some of the other cities in order to prevent the march by the insurgents. And also the Iranian Foreign Minister, Abbas Araghchi, had made a statement even yesterday saying that we will provide whatever assistance needed in order to confront these terrorist groups in Syria. But obviously, their hands are also very much tied. They have not been able to provide the kind of support that Assad needed because of Russia's involvement in Ukraine war, and of course Iran's involvement in support of Hezbollah in Lebanon, which has been substantially weakened by Israeli operations over the last 2-3 months. And that also has provided an opportunity or the necessary space for the Syrian insurgents to rise to the occasion and to make very quick territorial gains. This development is likely to please Turkey under the President Tayyip Erdogan, who's trying to lead Turkey on a more moderate path of Islamist change and development. But on the other side of the regional spectrum, it could also be pleasing to Israel. Because the Israelis always wanted to weaken Iran's forward front against Israel, and I think to some extent they may have succeeded.
To what extent do you think the insurgents planned their march south, factoring in big global events like the war in Ukraine, like the upcoming US presidential inauguration? How much were they thinking about that as they timed their march?
I'm sure that the leadership of this particular group, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, may have been very conscious of that. I mean, they have been observing the developments on the Ukrainian front as well as on the Gaza and Lebanese fronts. And I think they had sensed that Iran's position was quite really weakening, and also Russia was not really in a position to provide the kind of support which was the Assad regime needed, and therefore they may have, or at least they may have strategically thought about it, and therefore take advantage of the opportunity that is arisen.
And just in the last hour, we've heard from the IDF saying that they have moved troops into Syria along the border there. How may this play out politically for Israel?
Well, I mean, that's another important development in how Israel is going to really deal with it. I mean, of course, but what I think the Israelis may do, I mean, they've already occupied the Golan Heights from Syria since 1967. And now they may want to really more securitize that border with Syria. Because, I mean, apart from everything else, the al-Sham group has been known as a radical Islamist group, and it is a reincarnation of Jabhat al-Nusra, which came into existence in 2012 in Syria, in close linkage with al-Qaeda. And of course, from that point of view, the Israelis would be quite concerned about what this particular group is likely to do in spearheading the current successful uprisings.
Ayman Saikel, Emeritus Professor of Middle Eastern, Central Asian and Islamic Studies at the Australian National University. Thank you for your insights.
My pleasure.
OK, so if you're just joining us, welcome to our continuing coverage of these dramatic developments in Syria over the past 24 hours. We've been following it closely over the past week or so. There's a lot of surprise about just how fast this rebel advance had proceeded through Aleppo in particular. and then down towards the south. And just in the last 24 hours, or last kind of 4 or 5 hours, we've heard that the rebels have taken Damascus and that Bashar al-Assad has fled Syria. We've got our Global Affairs editor, John Lyons, with us. John, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade has just issued a statement. I can read that out. Are you across that? Yeah, so the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade is monitoring the unfolding events in Syria closely, including reports that armed groups have now seized control of Damascus and President Assad has departed Syria. We emphasise that all parties must protect civilians, restore services and ensure the safety of ethnic and religious minorities. While the situation remains fluid, we urge parties not to further fuel this cycle of conflict and instead re-engage with the UN-facilitated peace process. And John, I might just get your reflections on that in terms of a reflection of the West and how the West has approached what's been happening in Syria over the past decade or so.
Well, Joe, it's a very unusual, awkward situation for the West, Israel in particular, and the US. The first part of the sentence that Bashar al-Assad has left Syria would make a lot of people happy in the West. But the second part of that sentence, that they've been replaced by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, a jihadist group from Idlib, will also strike fear into a lot of people because now they control one of the largest chemical weapons supplies in the world, and it's such a intersection, Syria, of all sorts of influences, that what the world needs there, what the Middle East needs, is stability in Syria in particular, because physically, geographically, it's so central to the Middle East. It's so much a part of the proxies that have all been operating there. There's so many international forces on Syria, the Americans, the Israelis, the Iranians, the Russians, the Kurds, the Turks. And so now to have this sort of chaos there, although there's scenes at the moment of celebration, I think that the next few days and weeks there could be very dangerous.
And there have been stories of atrocities committed by the Assad regime over the years. Just take us through how that regime has ruled Syria for the past 50 years.
It's been ruled with fear. Bashar al-Assad's father, Hafez al-Assad, through the 70s and 80s was one of the most feared figures in the Middle East. He oversaw massacres of his own people. He was completely ruthless. The place, the intelligence services, the security services put fear into people. That's what makes these scenes so extraordinary and remarkable, that one of the hardest regimes in the Middle East. Let's not forget that the Assad regime survived the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring saw the fall of many of these dictators, Hosni Mubarak in Egypt. The crowds moved against him and he fell. In Libya, where I went to cover Gaddafi, the public reacted in demonstrations against Colonel Gaddafi. He ended up dying an appalling death at the hands of a lot of demonstrators. The sort of things they did to him you couldn't even talk about on television. But so these different dictators were being pursued, yet Bashar al-Assad survived because Russia wanted him to survive, Iran wanted him to survive. Iran brought in Hezbollah to fight his battles. Hezbollah had terrible battles with major Sunni groups. So it was Hezbollah versus al-Qaeda, which of course led to this new group, or this group, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, came out of al-Qaeda. They're now saying, we're different from al-Qaeda, we're not the sort of the hardline jihadist group. But I think it will see in the next coming weeks that I think instability in Syria, unless there's something remarkable happens, I suspect this is just the beginning of the next violent chapter.
And that international support that Bashar al-Assad relied so heavily upon has peeled away in the last couple of months.
That's right. This group struck while they were distracted. Russia is too busy fighting its own battle in Ukraine, which is much more costly. Don't forget, Vladimir Putin thought that he could conquer Kyiv within 3 or 4 days. We're now coming up to the 3rd year anniversary of that in February. And that has been a horrible war for everybody. And he's now trying to recapture part of his own territory, Kursk. The Iranians now have been seriously hit. The Israelis say they're ready to, they'll strike again. And Hezbollah, Hamas, all of these other groups, proxies of Iran, have been hit. And so Syria they could move weapons through Syria into Lebanon. A few months ago, I was in Lebanon and you could see the crossing into Syria where it's believed weapons would come across a land crossing, which I think Israel has since bombed. So, this was Assad had all of the ducks in a row. He got all of his security apparatus and now he's gone.
And does the Gaza conflict have anything to do with this at all?
The Gaza conflict has, I think, just added to that brought a lot of the other conflicts to the fore in the Middle East. It's brought the Hezbollah obviously got involved to support Hamas after the second or third day that war began. Now, obviously, Hezbollah and Israel have just come to a ceasefire, but that really weakened Hezbollah, that war. There's no question that Israel won that war recently in southern Lebanon. Beirut's been hit, Hezbollah's been hit, Iran is weaker now than it's been before. And I think Bashar al-Assad thought, as always, Russia and Iran and Hezbollah will come to help me. They were nowhere to be seen, nor were his own soldiers who fled, put their guns down and fled.
OK, so there's a lot of celebration now on the streets of Damascus and around Syria, and we also saw with our correspondent Eric Torchek on the border with Turkey, where the Syrians who fled the country are now hoping to get back in, or now coming back in. But what realistically, what awaits them, and what does it look like this new regime, if you can call it that, will greet them with?
Well, I think the key to it now will be Turkey and Recep Tayyip Erdogan. He's emerged in recent years as a real kingmaker in the Middle East. And, he's often underestimated by people. He himself is authoritarian. He himself runs a brutal regime. He imprisons more journalists, I think, than almost any other country. He runs a very tight ship with an iron fist. And I think now Turkey will be crucial because they've been quite supportive of this group. And I think it'll be perhaps Turkey will try to say to Russia and Iran, let's try to work out something here that's sustainable.
Yeah. OK, I will leave it there for the moment. Thanks for your analysis, John Lyons.
We're going to bring in Ali Mamouri now, who is a research fellow at Deakin University, specialising in Middle East studies. Ali, thank you so much for joining us. First up, I just wanted to get your take on how the rebels were able to effect their takeover so quickly and effectively.
Thank you for having me. It was actually a very significant surprise for almost all the analysts and experts who've been...
can we get a minute?
In Syria. I think I lost the line.
Sorry, we may be having connectivity issues. Are you still with us? Are you still with us, Ali?
Yes, I hear you. Do you hear me?
Yes, sorry, I think we lost you for a second there. Can you just sort of describe what the last 54 years has looked like in Syria under the Assad regime?
Yeah, of course. As the previous expert mentioned correctly, Assad was one of the most brutal dictators in the region. To make connection and understand the context, he's from the same political party of Saddam Hussein, so it was Ba'ath Party, which had two different branches, one in Iraq, another one in Syria. And we already know a lot about the brutal political practice of Saddam Hussein in about 3 decades in Iraq before 2003. Assad regime, both the father and the son, all belong to the same ideology, and they practice the same brutal suppressing of their own people during decades of ruling the country.
We've heard from the United Nations Special Envoy for Syria, who's called for an orderly political transition. Do you think that that is something that can happen, a peaceful transition into a new regime?
Considering the political situation and the sharp division in the country in Syria, it seems very unlikely to me. Syria now is divided among 3 main political groups, which is divided also based on ethnic and religious lines as well. We have the Kurds, we have the Sunnis, and we have the Alawites. And they are located in different parts of the country. The Sunni opposition, who are a part of the opposition that took over Damascus now as well, they are also formed of several opposing groups, and they are not belong to one ideology or one group. It's expected to see and to witness some kind of conflict among them in the near future as well. It seems to me that Syria is going toward more chaos and a very chaotic situation in the near future.
Right, so can you speak a little bit more about what you anticipate the next few weeks to look like in Syria with this takeover?
It seems that in the next few weeks we're going to see more celebration, and we're going to see more overtaking some other small remaining of the country. But soon after is expected to see clashes between the opposition, the Sunni opposition, and the Kurds, because they are getting close to each other. And in the past, there was some kind of buffer zone between them. The regime had been under control of the area between the two main groups. But after controlling Damascus, now the buffer zone is gone, and it's likely to see in the near future some kind of clashes between them, and gradually they will advance toward Laodikia, the coastal area, which is under control of Alawites, who were pro-regimes in the past. So in the near few weeks, it seems to be a bit calm and seeing more celebration and more political statements, but gradually I'm expecting to see clashes between the three main parties.
All right, we'll leave it there. Ali Mamouri, Research Fellow at Deakin University, specialising in Middle East studies. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Let's now speak again with Middle East correspondent Eric Torchek, who joins us from the Turkey-Syria border, where it looks like there is a lot happening. Eric, just explain for us who you're standing with there.
So I'm standing with Syrians in Turkey. I'm in the town of Rehanle, Joe, which is very close to the Syrian border. As you can see, enormous celebrations here. It's deafening, as you can see. Just joyous celebrations.
And Eric, I guess, this is a reflection of what these people and their relatives and friends have been through in Syria over the decades under the Bashar al-Assad regime. Just explain for us how brutal that regime has been and how many people have fled the country because of that into Turkey.
So particularly in the last 13 years, Joe, millions of Syrians fled overseas and hundreds of thousands died in the civil war. But prior to that, Bashar al-Assad's father, Hafez al-Assad, built a security state like no other in the world. Millions of Syrians have lost relatives to the prisons, to the repression of that state, so much so that it became known as the Kingdom of Silence. And for years, these people have been forced to live away from their homes in a foreign country, and elsewhere in Europe too, all over the world. Syrians live in exile because of that security state. They don't know what happened to their relatives. Thousands of people are being freed from prisons. Just look at the relief. Just look at the feeling. He's saying Syria. He's saying Syria freedom. Okay. Yeah, come on. He's saying that they're saying Syria freedom. Syria's free. Shooting a hunter, they're saying Syria is free now. This is the joy, Joe.
And Eric, can you tell us if many of these people plan to return to Syria now?
Yes, they're all saying to me, Shabab. Okay, they're saying. They're saying now they can finally return. They're saying thank you to Turkey. Thank you for looking after us. But our country, we have our country back. That's what they're telling me.
Yeah. Is there a bit of uncertainty, though, about what they're returning to and about these rebels who have taken control?
Yeah, they don't know. I mean, many are waiting to see what happens. But, I mean, as you can see, overwhelmingly, it's just joy and relief right now. I think those questions will come later. A lot of people have been here for many, many years. They want to see what happens. They want to see how stable it is. But I'm talking to people in Syria. They are racing to the capital now. All these people, they want to go home. They want to go home.
And presumably the Turkish, and this is part of the motivation for the Turkish government having played such a key role in developments there in Syria, because the Turkish government would like to see these millions of refugees being able to head back into Syria.
Absolutely. That's one of the key reasons that the government of President Erdogan has been very supportive of Syrian opposition groups. It's not just, political and geopolitical reasons. It's domestic politics has been driving this to a large extent. Earlier this year, President Erdogan and the Turkish government tried to re-establish relationships with Syria's President Assad, and it failed. They said Assad rejected their overtures, and now we see a major assault by Turkey-backed Syrian rebel groups that has taken Damascus and led to the collapse of the Syrian regime. So in Turkey, they're saying Assad is reaping what he sowed by ignoring the overtures from Turkey. This solves a major domestic political problem for Turkey. For these people also, they're very grateful to Turkey, but they don't want to stay here. I mean, many of them are saying they want to go home. And for Turkey, that will be an enormous relief. It takes that political pressure of President Erdogan. He is a real victor in this, actually. For years, he was criticised for his support of Syrian refugees, for Turkey accepting so many. It caused him a lot of headaches. And also, there were big questions about his support for Syrian opposition groups and Turkey's role in interference in Syria. And Turkey had a major role in the Idlib province, which came under attack 4 years ago. Turkey's military has been heavily involved in northern Syria. All of that now appears to have been vindicated.
And Eric, we can see the obvious joy of the people around you there, the joy and the optimism. You're close. We might just have to leave it there because I don't think Eric's going to be able to hear us. But yeah, just live shots there from the Turkey-Syria border with our correspondent Eric Torchek in amongst the people who plan to return. Actually, the crowd's quieting down now. We'll let you go there. Okay, Eric Torchek there on the Turkey-Syria border.
Some chaotic scenes of celebration there.
Indeed.
Well, let's recap on our breaking news. The IDF says in light of recent events in Syria, they're deploying forces into what they call a buffer zone to ensure the safety of the communities in the Golan Heights and the citizens of Israel. The Syrian president has reportedly fled the country, and Islamist forces have begun a negotiation of a transition of power with the country's prime minister after taking the capital, Damascus. There are reports of celebrations on the streets as a rebel coalition led by Islamist group HTS enters the centre of President Bashar al-Assad's almost quarter-century rule over Syria, and we did see some of those celebrations with Eric Torchek just then. The insurgents swiftly took over large parts of the country over the past 10 days. Aleppo and then Hama and then the central city of Homs fell one after the other. The president, who inherited power after the death of his father, Hafez al-Assad, in 2000, has reportedly fled the capital to an unknown location. Army chiefs are understood to have told officers that Bashar al-Assad's rule has ended. This is a dramatic development in a 13-year-old civil war which began amid the Arab Spring in 2011.
And we've got some live pictures now from the Lebanon-Syria border. You can see the huge lines of traffic. We were just talking to our correspondent Eric Torchek on the Turkey-Syria border, and you can see the joy of the people there. I was endeavouring to ask Eric a final question about if there were lines of traffic near where he was. We're speaking to all those very optimistic people. I didn't get a chance to ask that question because the crowd got a little enthusiastic, but that's another indication of what's happening there in the Middle East with this dramatic news in the last 4 or 5 hours that Bashar al-Assad has fled Syria. Damascus has fallen and the rebels have taken control. We saw a media conference there with the rebels just in the last hour or so, saying that Damascus had fallen, and they we're talking about the future of Syria and respecting Syria. As I was talking to Eric, the future remains uncertain. They don't know exactly what they're going to get with these new group of rebels who've taken over.
Well, earlier we heard from Dr. Roger Shanahan, a Middle East analyst, who says the insurgent offensive against the Syrian regime was evidently well planned.
Militarily, it's very difficult to regain momentum once it's been lost, and certainly the opposition groups chose their time well. There'd been preparation over many, many months for this to occur, and that was evident in the way that they deployed, but also made sure that after they had taken over a location, there was an administrative tail that could at least calm the population and let them know that there was, in place of chaos, some administrative capacity. So they were able to build up a significant degree of momentum and focused on the large provincial capitals rather than much slower advance through the rural areas. And as they became aware that the Syrian military was not putting up a fight much at all, then they took advantage of that and probably accelerated their operational aims and stayed well in advance of the Syrian regime's ability to cope with it. Not only the Syrian regimes, but also regional states who are really responding to fast-folding events on the ground.
Why do you think it is that we saw that lack of resistance? Was it an inability to resist, or were people, happy to see the rebels come in?
Probably a combination of there's rarely one factor that leads to this. A gradual hollowing out of the capabilities of the Syrian military. When it comes down to it, conflicts on the ground are really a battle of wills, and if one side truly believes in the cause that they're fighting for and the other side believes far less in the cause that they're fighting for, then one side wins that battle of wills and they can build up this military momentum. Syrian military, largely a conscript army, not entirely, and that's probably one of the more concerning, puzzling things about how the formations like the 4th Division were not deployed earlier in key parts of the terrain to Damascus's north to try and buy them time. Because what we saw at the outbreak of the uprising in 2012 was a similar collapse of large parts of the Syrian military. But there was time for, first of all, Iranian-backed elements and then later Russia to come to the assistance of the Assad regime. Things happened so quickly this time, and the resistance put up by the Syrian military was so ineffective that neither of those countries really came to the assistance of the Assad regime because they didn't believe that it was going to survive.
Yeah, can you speak a bit more to the political significance of Syria, especially its importance to many of the world's superpowers who have vested interests in the country?
Well, listen, it's an extremely complex country, and that's going to be one of the issues in the future about the after the euphoria has died down of the fall of the Assad regime. How do you actually govern a country that is, in effect, an artificially constructed country? Regionally, it has provided over the last few years the conduit between Iran and its allies, particularly Hezbollah, in terms of a land main supply route between those two countries through Iraq and then through Syria and into Lebanon. It's also been the key Middle Eastern ally for Russia for longer than even the Assad regime has been there. And there have been tens of thousands of Russian advisors who have passed through Syria over more than half a century, and the port at Tartus and the airbase near to it has provided a logistic footprint for Russia in the eastern Mediterranean and has allowed it not only to have influence in Syria but more broadly. So if they were to lose that, that would be a strategic blow for Russia's global influence. And then there's the issue with Syria, which still occupies Syrian territory in the Golan Heights. And Syria under Assad had characterised itself as a leader of the Arab resistance to Israel, never had a peace treaty and was wholly objectioned to that. So it's a key part of the puzzle, given its geographic location, given its historical relevance, but also given the nature of the Syrian country itself in the north, with its Kurdish minority, which brings in Turkey, who wants to control its equities on the southern border. It is a significant player in the region, and the fall of the Assad regime is going to have reverberations for years to come.
We've heard the United Nations Special Envoy for Syria calling for an orderly political transition. I mean, after 54 years of an Assad regime, what will the challenges be in that transition?
Yes, we've already seen, as we said, the opposition groups were quite well organised in terms of their planning in the event of success. They've obviously had to accelerate those plans, but we've already seen the Syrian Prime Minister get on state television and say there would be an orderly transfer of responsibilities. And also we've seen from Tahrir al-Sham put out a public statement that telling its armed elements not to approach public buildings. And so what we're seeing in the short term, at least, is Tahrir al-Sham wanting to maintain the technical abilities of, as far as possible, of the Syrian state to provide services to the population. Obviously, they don't want to inherit a system any more broken than it currently is, and it makes for a much more orderly transition when they formally take over power, to have a state that is still functioning, unlike what we've seen in some of the other transitions in the region. The issues obviously are going to be much more in the months and the years to come for an ideologically based opposition group. Can you then rule for all and rule fairly for all? What kind of laws are you going to govern under? What's the constitution going to look like? Those are for tomorrow and the days after. But in the short term, it looks as though there's been a reasonably ordered transition and a desire to have technocrats still in charge of state services in the short term, at least.
Reuters has been reporting that the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad boarded a plane and left Damascus, that he went to an unknown location. Where might he have gone, and what could be the future for him?
Yeah, listen, it's very difficult to tell where he's gone, and probably it's not going to be made public until they're sure that he and whoever else is related to him or needs to leave the country has left the country. There's probably a limited list of people who he may have gone to, and he may have gone to a country in the short term because these events happened so rapidly that he was most likely taken by surprise, as much as the regional state. So we don't know where he is at the moment. It may be an interim stop until a longer-term solution for his ongoing presence is sorted out, but he will be persona non grata for the remainder of his life.
Roger Shanahan there. So if you're just joining us, this is our special coverage of the dramatic developments in Syria. More than half a century of Assad family rule in Syria appears to be over after an insurgent offensive that began less than a fortnight ago swept rapidly south and has taken over the capital, Damascus.
Reporting on state television, the opposition has declared the capital liberated and that all prisoners of the Assad regime have been released. Rebel forces led by Islamist group HTS have begun negotiating a transition of power with the country's Prime Minister. President Bashar al-Assad has reportedly fled the city, bringing an end to an autocratic regime which began under his father, Hafez al-Assad, in the early 1970s.
It's a dramatic development in a 13-year-old civil war which began amid the Arab Spring in 2011.
We're joined now by Dr. Rifai Thomas, who's a Syrian activist and academic. He's in Sydney. Rifai, thank you so much for joining us to share your experience and expertise. I know, as well as being an expert, you have experienced Syria under the Assad regime firsthand. Given that, how are you feeling about today's news?
Thank you so much for having me. There are literally no words to describe how I'm feeling. It's mostly relief. It's joy at the possibility of an end of injustice. Not just a possibility of it's becoming an actual reality now, but we're also hoping for that to continue for the future. And into the shelling, to the bombardment, the release of political prisoners. We've seen photos and video images documenting political prisoners being released and family members reuniting after nearly over a decade of being separated. We've seen a decrease in the violence of the shelling of residential areas. So that's all great news, and that's all why I think we saw in the videos earlier, a lot of people are overjoyed, celebrating. A lot of us are, most millions of Syrians now have the possibility of going back home. I'm one of those people. I worked in Syria as a citizen journalist before. I'm from Qusayr, which is a town near Homs, one of the strategic cities in Syria, and it was one of the centers of the opposition as well. And it really came under heavy bombardment and the sieges. Thousands of people died, and now the possibility of being able to actually go back to visit, to contribute, to rebuild the country it's incredible. It really is. We can't sleep, we can't sit still. My family and I are just dancing around, laughing. We can't believe that after 13, 14 years, it's actually happening, and it's actually happening on such a dramatic scale and then with this speed, especially because a lot of researchers and analysts have warned us about this moment. When the regime falls, it's going to be chaos, it's going to be bloodshed, the minorities would be executed, all of this fear. And now, looking at the early stages at least, it's very promising. And I think that's a cause for celebration, a cause for, obviously, we're also concerned, we also have some big challenges ahead of us. There are still questions that we won't know the answer for till the days to come. However, the early signs are very promising.
And so, Rifai Thomas, you talk with such optimism about the future now and a possible end to the injustice. Give us an insight into the extent of those injustices committed by Bashar al-Assad over the decades.
I mean, just to give you a bit of a personal side to this story, right? While we were leaving Qusayr, while we're evacuating, so this is when Qusayr fell to the hands of the regime and we're evacuating and we're told there is some kind of agreement. The evacuees were targeted. That's how I lost my brother, my youngest brother, Hadi. And my father also died in the indiscriminate shelling of residential areas the week before that. And then a few days before that was my uncle. A lot of families, a lot of other extended families, friends. This was the reality of the indiscriminate shelling, the reality of people being imprisoned for decades, even before the revolution began, and then it turned and it evolved, and all the complexity that came with it. So this is just one example. There are millions of stories of people being displaced, of people being detained, forcibly detained, and now we're seeing their images being freed. I think this is literally the biggest cause for celebration. I understand the need for caution. However, we can't help but feel overjoyed at just seeing people being treated like people, people not fearing that next day may not come, they may not be with their family members. And again, it doesn't really take away from, of course, planning for the future, thinking what the next steps, but I think that will have to come. Maybe we're just trying to focus now on the celebration, and then hopefully the future would be a brighter one. It can't get any worse. I think we've been told it could be worse. I don't think it can. I think we've seen the worst. We've seen chemical weapons by Assad regime used on civilians. We've seen barrel bombs dropped on residential areas. We've seen the human rights watches, like just Human Rights Watch, documenting abuse after abuse by the regime and by its allies as well as other groups, of course. So we're really hopeful that this is the beginning of a new chapter in Syria that will be a chapter that would include everyone, respect everyone's rights, regardless of their religious or ethnic backgrounds. We're really hopeful, and I think like the last 11 days, the way of course, like the lack of support from Russia, the lack of support of Iran and Hezbollah played a huge role in the collapse of the regime. But I think we mustn't forget that this is a grassroots movement from the ground up. So the advancement from the south of Syria up to join the other forces from the north, what does that tell you? That really tells you how much support this movement has among the people. The celebrations we're seeing, the images I'm seeing, it's unbelievable, honestly unbelievable. Shouldn't be surprising, but after 13, 14 years of living like this, we really couldn't believe it. We couldn't it still caught us by surprise. And the fact that this could be behind us, and now we're beginning a new chapter of Syria. Again, there will be challenges, there will be concerns, but we'll deal with them just like we dealt with the Assad regime. The people, just like the way the people never gave up, never stopped resisting. So I think we shouldn't forget that this also succeeded because Syrians learned from their mistakes. There are a lot of lessons they learned along the way, and that also is important to take into account, Syrians' agency.
We can hear you really tempering your optimism with caution, but you speak about this new chapter. What is the best case scenario? With the next few weeks, how would you like to see, the next little while play out in your home country of Syria?
We've heard from rebel groups saying that they're keen to maintain the government, the institutional infrastructure of institutions in Syria. And that's really key, that's really important to keep the prime minister in charge till there's peaceful transfer of power to the civilians. We've heard the rebel groups also saying that they're really keen they're happy to dissolve and to allow the civilians, representative civilians to rule. That would be the best case scenario, to actually allow that to happen. And I think there is a really golden opportunity. We're also hearing from the SDF leader saying that they're also keen to maintain the unity of Syria. I think that's really key. And I think for any transitional period in Syria, it's really important to ensure that everyone, and I literally mean everyone inside Syria, is represented, is respected, is treated fairly. Like I said, the signs we've seen for the past 10, 12 days are very promising. We really hope that it will continue this way, that there will be an actual transfer of power to the civilian authorities, there will be a representative government, transitional government, and that would be the best case scenario, really. And there are a lot more other worst scenarios that could happen, and I think what Syrians would be dealing with them, having learned a lot of mistakes, but we'll just have to wait and see.
Rifai, you mentioned before the trauma of losing family members to the Assad regime. Your father, your brother, your uncle, you lost many relatives. Was it clear to you what was driving the regime? What was the motivation with the horrors that were committed?
Where to begin? Where to begin? There is a lot of research looking at why authoritarian regimes behave the way they do. And I think for the Assad regime, it was really about the way it's structured, the way it came to power by force, the way it thought it can stay in power, again, mainly through force, maybe through violence. It knew it doesn't really enjoy support within the population, or like the majority support of the majority. Of course, there are some Syrians who still support the regime, who supported the regime. And I also, like on that point, I must acknowledge that my own experiences to the viewers, my own experiences as an activist, as a part of the Syrian revolutionary movement back in Syria, as a researcher as well, even doing my research on the Assad regime, on the UN political process, this all influenced what I'm sharing with the viewers today. And I think it's really important for everyone, each one of us, to actually do their proper research, to actually dig a bit behind the headlines, even what I'm saying, to actually verify everything I'm saying and to check the sources and make informed opinions about what's happening, because it's really divisive, and the narratives that are being pushed about what's happening in Syria can be very problematic and disempowering to a lot of Syrians who've been living under oppression for decades. Yes, like I said, we shouldn't discount the real genuine concerns that many have. And I really hope that these concerns will be addressed in the next few weeks, months, and years. But to your point, I think it's, like I said, it's the nature of the regime. It's really the instincts of survival. The regime really felt the threat when the people rose to the streets to demand freedom, demand dignity. We often call it the dignity revolution, Thawrat al-Karama. And I think that's really an emphasis on freedom, and that's really what scared the regime, that it can't stay in power if it's really allowed genuine participation from all Syrians. And I think it's knowing this, there was only one way forward for the regime to stay in power the way it did, violence. I wish it didn't go that way, of course, wish not over 500,000 Syrians died as a result of all this. Mostly at the hands of the Assad regime and its military apparatus, security apparatus, but it did. The regime clearly felt that was the only way. I do believe there are other ways, but in its mentality, they probably thought this is the way to stay in power. Again, like once you start on a path of oppression, then it's really hard, it becomes increasingly hard to go back on it, especially when you look at the massacres after massacre that happened throughout Syria. And I think we shouldn't lose sight of that there is a possibility, even if it's a slim one, that this might all end. That we may not have the same level of oppression, the same level of shelling, the same level of... We should look at the facts on the ground, I think, rather than look at obviously there is a fear of now jihadism and Islamism, and there is a fear of terrorism and all of the ism that's out there. But we shouldn't forget that this regime was always prided itself to be secular, to be respecting minorities, to be respecting majorities, and it didn't. I mean, we can just look at what's behavior over the last 50 years, especially the last 10 years. And we should know that, we should be careful and vigilant and aware of any regime coming to power, regardless of what they claim, regardless of their ideology, and look at their behavior, really. And I think that's what we should be focusing on right now. In Syria and other countries, look at the behavior of the groups that are inside, especially the armed groups. Are they really gonna follow on their promises and actually allow for a peaceful transfer of power? We'll have to wait and see. I'm very hopeful, and I think this hope is not unfounded. And if not, and if these hopes aren't realized, then I think we're more than capable. Syrians are not more than capable to dealing with these challenges ahead.
Rifai, what kind of personal connections do you have with people in Syria now? Do you have family there, friends there, and are you now thinking about the possibility maybe of being able to go back and see them?
Absolutely. I have aunts, uncles, cousins, friends, relatives, you name it. And they're all telling me, when are you going to visit us? We can't wait. My sister, when she left Syria, she was 4 or 5 years old, and she was telling a friend of ours, we're not going to come back till the Assad regime falls. And now this cousin telling us, oh, remember when your sister said so-and-so, and now it's time to go back. So we're very excited. I've been speaking to my relatives inside Syria, again, huge amount of joy. The fact that you can actually speak to them freely, you can actually talk to them and ask them real questions, and then they don't have to talk to you in code words. And it's beyond, and the ability to be able now to go back, actually, the possibility you can actually visit, you can play a role, see what role to play. Now we're looking at not just me, there are thousands and millions of Syrians across the world. And now I'm sure most of them, if not the majority of them, would be looking for ways to contribute in their own ways, whether in their host countries, in the new homes, or back in Syria, in their home country. There is a lot of us, a lot of work to do. My wife, who was, I met here, and she's born here, and she's not Syrian. She was like, when are we gonna go back? We're already having those chats. Are we gonna go back? And I'm like, you gotta calm down. We just gotta wait and see. We have 2 kids, 2 young kids. Let's wait, let's see. And inshallah, hopefully, there will be a day when we can all visit. We can all know about that part of the history. Talking about my kids and my wife, and hopefully we'll be reunited with everyone, family members, friends, be able to see your home. Lastly, I'd like to end on that the price of this, what we're witnessing over the past few days, was not cheap. People paid for this outcome with their lives, with their, being displaced, knowing the consequences. When Syrians took to the streets in 2011, it's not like they did not know and they were just hoping maybe the US would come and intervene. It wasn't just that. They knew the consequences. They knew. They were living through the Assad regime for years. And they still did it. They still resisted, and they went on, and they paid the price for it. And now we're reaping the benefits of those actions, of these sacrifices. The death of my father, the death of my brother, my uncle, hundreds of thousands of Syrians who paid for this with their blood, with their lives, with everything. Now we're getting the outcome, and I think that's why I'm excited. That's why millions of Syrians can't contain their joy about what's happening. And no matter what happens, I think we can deal with it. I think even the regions have seen the consequences of even appeasing a seemingly sectarian regime, and a regime that seems to promote itself as protecting Syrians' unity and minorities and stuff. And hopefully the next phase will really teach us that even a group like HTS and other allied groups, because it's not just HTS like we discussed, other armed groups, locals joined them, residents all rose up collectively. But hopefully, even if it's HTS, it remains to be seen if even a group like them might be able to better govern Syria in a better way, and hopefully able to even themselves change. Because I think there was a chance that HTS might change and evolve and become a better version than it used to be, than the Assad regime ever had a chance.
Really important reflections. Dr. Rifai Thomas, a Syrian activist and academic, thank you so much for your personal and professional insights.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And Middle East correspondent Matthew Doran joins us now from Jerusalem. Matthew, g'day. So things have been moving so quickly over the past 24 hours. What's been the response from across the region to the developments?
On to this news, and I think one of the most telling at the moment is the response of Israel and the Israel Defence Forces. We learned last night that it was positioning more Israeli troops and weapons in the Golan Heights, the occupied territory which borders Syria, and we have since learned this morning that the IDF has actually deployed troops into the Syrian buffer zone. This is a UN-enforced buffer zone between the Golan Heights and Syria, and the IDF says it has deployed troops in there to protect Israel and the citizens of Israel. It is insisting it is not meaning to interfere in the affairs of Syria. It's merely picking up on the fact that there is a lot of activity, a lot of military activity, fighting that is happening, and that is why it's moving in there. However, we have seen reports in local Israeli media now that the Israeli military is warning the Syrian rebels not to come close to the Israel border because they will be fired upon if they do so. So that is a potential flashpoint that has erupted in the last hour or so. We have also heard from the Jordanian government, the southern neighbour of Syria, saying that it is monitoring this situation closely, but it wants to ensure that there is security within this Middle East region. And in the last hour or so, we've been hearing from one of the advisors to the United Arab Emirates government, again saying that the security of this region should be paramount, and saying that the reason that this has occurred is partly because of the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad and his political failures, refusing to negotiate and to concede any ground here in this long-running civil war, that brought him undone, and that is why these rebel forces have been able to gather and launch this attack. So that response, those reactions still coming in. It is very early here in the Middle East, but everyone is watching what's happening just over the border very, very closely.
And Matthew, to what extent has Israel actually played a role in what's happened through its very effective degrading of Hezbollah and attacks on Iran?
Well, yeah, I think that is something that we need to analyse quite a lot at the moment, because it is worth pointing out that the surprise attack which really kick-started this whole advance on Damascus, which was the rebel forces taking the city of Aleppo in Syria's north, that came just a couple of days after this ceasefire was enacted between Israel and the Lebanese militant group Hezbollah, the Iranian-backed group which has in turn been backing the Assad regime. So a couple of days after that ceasefire was put into place, and we know that Hezbollah in Lebanon was significantly depleted as a result of its ongoing conflict with Israel, that is when the rebel fighters started to launch their offensive. Now, there would have been a whole bunch of factors playing into when they launched that attack, but I think the timing of it cannot be ignored. And certainly Israel and these rebel fighters have both had a shared goal here, wanting to get rid of the Assad regime. That's probably to the extent of where their shared goals reach. I don't think it's necessarily a case where Israel and the opposition forces will have very much in common in terms of their ideology, in terms of what they want to see happen in Syria and more broadly in the Middle East region as a result of that. But the timing is certainly worth throwing into the mix there as leading to this situation. And there have been many people here in Israel and in Benjamin Netanyahu's government today assessing exactly what this means for the broader security within the Middle East and the security of Israel.
OK, Matthew Doran reporting there from Jerusalem.
And we'll bring in our Global Affairs editor, John Lyons, now, who's in the studio with us. Hi, John. So who is this new group in charge?
Well, Ruby, it's a good point. We've seen scenes of celebration there by the falling of the Assad regime, which was unquestionably a brutal regime. But it's worth us knowing who this new group is who now runs Syria as of tonight. According to the Australian government's assessment, Tahrir al-Sham is a Sunni Islamist, religiously motivated, violent extremist group based in northwestern Syria. HTS opposes the government of Bashar al-Assad and aims to replace the government with an Islamic caliphate. And they go on to conclude, this is when they listed them as a terrorist organisation. On the basis of the above information, the Australian government assesses that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is directly or indirectly engaged in preparing, planning, assisting in or fostering the doing of terrorist acts. And so I think that amongst all those scenes of celebration, we should bear in mind, and this is a fairly sober assessment by the Australian government based on information, that I don't think people should be celebrating this group taking control.
To what extent has the group tried to walk back on that characterisation?
It has certainly tried, like the Taliban tried. They said, remember, the new Taliban would be different from the old Taliban, but at the end of the day, you are who your characteristics are, and this is a group that has wanted and still wants an Islamic caliphate, so people can make their judgment on that.
And John, the world's eyes are on Syria now. I mean, what are the different countries around the world watching for?
I think that people will be hoping for stability, and I think Russia's lost badly today, Iran's lost badly, the US and Israel will be pleased Assad's gone, worried about this new group. At the end of the day, I think the key power breaker now, the kingmaker now, is Turkey. Turkey will decide, I think, will try to ensure this is a stable change, perhaps to some form of democracy. Turkey, I think, is the hope of the world in terms of stability, because without their influence, this could become a real rabble.
And just watching these live pictures now, we were just talking to our correspondent a little earlier, Eric Torchek, on the Turkey-Syria border, jubilation there. While there are serious reservations about this new group that appears to have taken control, can you understand that after the decades of the horror under the rule of Bashar al-Assad, these people are looking forward to something that there's a flicker of hope there?
Absolutely. Similar to Iran 1979, the Iranians were delighted at the end of the Shah. He ran a brutal regime propped up by the United States. In came the Islamic Republic, the Ayatollahs became just as brutal. So I can understand their joy. Let's hope the future has some stability and some moderation.
Global Affairs Editor John Lyons, thank you. And that is where we'll leave our rolling coverage of the fall of the Syrian regime. We will continue to bring you updates throughout the evening, and you can follow all the latest developments on our website, abc.net.au/news.
After this short break, Jeremy Fernandez will take you through tonight's main stories live from the ABC's new news studios in Parramatta in Sydney's West. Thanks for your company.